She was hired as a maid in a billionaire's mansion, but when he found out who she really was, he fell to his knees. The rain poured down relentlessly as she stood in front of the massive iron gates, her heart racing, her hands trembling. This wasn't just another job. For Clara, it was her last hope. She had nothing left, no family, no home, no future. But she wasn't looking for charity. She was here to earn her way, to survive. Little did she know the moment she crossed that threshold, her life would never be the same again. The billionaire who lived inside had everything money could buy: luxury, power, and influence. But what he didn't have, what he couldn't even see coming, was the truth. The truth about who this young woman really was, and the devastating revelation that would bring him to his knees. As the doors opened and their worlds collided, neither of them knew that the secrets they carried would change both of their lives forever. What happens when the person you trust the least becomes the one who holds the key to your redemption? You won't believe the shocking truth that unravels as this story unfolds. The rain fell in heavy sheets over the exclusive Hamptons neighborhood, obscuring the towering mansions that lined the pristine streets. At the end of a winding driveway, Clara Matthews stood motionless, her threadbare coat offering little protection against the biting November wind. Her eyes, filled with a mix of determination and desperation, were fixed on the imposing iron gates before her. Beyond those gates lay Seacliff Manor, the sprawling estate of Edward Marshall, one of America's most ruthless business tycoons. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched her worn resume, the paper already dampening from the relentless downpour. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. This wasn't just a job interview, it was the culmination of years of planning, heartache, and an unwavering desire for justice. As the gates slowly creaked open, Clara's mind flashed back to a time when her family's modest home in Queens had been filled with laughter and love. But those memories were now tainted by the bitter sting of loss, a loss orchestrated by the very man whose house she was about to enter. The long walk up the driveway felt like a march to the gallows. Each step brought Clara closer to confronting the architect of her family's destruction. The manicured lawns and meticulously pruned topiaries seemed to mock the struggle and hardship she had endured. At last, Clara reached the grand entrance of Seacliff Manor. Before she could knock, the massive oak door swung open, revealing a stern-faced housekeeper who ushered her inside without a word. The opulence of the foyer was staggering. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and priceless works of art adorned every surface. It was a stark reminder of the vast chasm between Clara's world and that of Edward Marshall. "Mr. Marshall will see you now," the housekeeper announced, her voice devoid of warmth. Clara nodded, swallowing hard as she followed the woman down a long hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Each step echoed ominously, matching the pounding of her heart. They arrived at a study that seemed larger than Clara's entire apartment. Seated behind an enormous mahogany desk was Edward Marshall himself, a man whose face had graced countless magazine covers and financial news segments. In person, he seemed both smaller and more imposing than Clara had imagined. Edward barely glanced up from his computer screen as Clara entered. "You're here for the maid position," he stated flatly, not bothering to phrase it as a question. "Yes, sir," Clara replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. She handed over her resume, noting how his manicured hands contrasted sharply with her own calloused fingers. Edward skimmed the document with disinterest. "Not much experience," he muttered, his tone dismissive. Clara's cheeks burned with a mixture of shame and anger. If only he knew the real reason she stood before him. How his corporate maneuverings had stripped her family of everything they held dear. How her father, once a proud small business owner, had been reduced to working 3 minimum-wage jobs just to keep food on the table. How her mother's health had deteriorated under the stress, leaving Clara to become the family's sole caretaker at the tender age of 18. But she revealed none of this. Instead, she squared her shoulders and met Edward's cold gaze. "I'm a quick learner, Mr. Marshall, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Something in her eyes seemed to catch Edward off guard. For a brief moment, his carefully constructed mask of indifference slipped, revealing a flicker of recognition, discomfort. Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Very well," Edward said, leaning back in his leather chair. "You'll start tomorrow. 6 a.m. sharp. Mrs. Holloway will show you out and provide the necessary details." Clara nodded, hardly daring to believe she had cleared this first hurdle. As she turned to leave, Edward's voice stopped her. "One more thing, miss." He glanced at her resume. "Matthews, I expect absolute discretion from my staff. What happens in this house stays in this house. Is that understood?" "Of course, Mr. Marshall," Clara replied, her tone neutral even as her insides churned with a mixture of triumph and trepidation. If only he knew the secrets she already carried, secrets that could bring his carefully constructed world crashing down around him. As Clara followed Mrs. Holloway out of the study, she allowed herself a small, grim smile. Phase 1 of her plan was complete. She was in. The housekeeper's clipped tones faded into background noise as Clara's mind raced with the possibilities that now lay before her. She had dreamed of this moment for years, plotting and planning how she would infiltrate Edward Marshall's life and make him pay for the devastation he had wrought upon her family and countless others. Yet as she stepped back out into the rain, a seed of doubt took root in her heart. The brief glimpse of humanity she had seen in Edward's eyes, that moment of recognition or discomfort, had caught her off guard. Was it possible there was more to this man than the heartless tycoon she had built up in her mind? Clara shook her head, banishing the thought. She couldn't afford to humanize Edward Marshall, not now when she was so close to her goal. As she walked back down the long driveway, Clara's resolve hardened once more. She thought of her father's slumped shoulders, of her mother's worn face, of the dreams and aspirations that had been snuffed out by corporate greed. No, there could be no wavering now. Little did Edward Marshall know that the unremarkable young woman he had just hired was about to turn his world upside down. The game was set, the players in position, and Clara Matthews was determined to see it through to its bitter end. As the iron gates closed behind her, sealing her fate, the narrator's voice whispers a chilling prophecy. If he only knew who really stood before him, he would have begged for forgiveness on his knees at that very moment. The rain continued to fall, washing away Clara's footprints as she disappeared into the gray afternoon. The stage was set for a drama of revenge, redemption, and unexpected revelations that would shake the very foundations of Seacliff Manor and the lives of all who dwelled within. The harsh fluorescent lights of the subway car flickered, casting an eerie glow on Clara's exhausted face as she made her way back to Queens. The events of the day replayed in her mind, each memory tinged with a mixture of determination and bitter nostalgia. As the train rattled through the tunnels beneath New York City, Clara's thoughts drifted to a time that seemed like a lifetime ago. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she was 10 years old again, standing in front of the modest 2-story house that had been her childhood home. The Matthews family had never been rich, but they had been happy. Clara's father, James, ran a small but thriving hardware store that had been in the family for generations. Her mother, Sarah, worked part-time as a nurse at the local clinic. Their home was always filled with laughter, the aroma of her mother's cooking, and the warmth of unconditional love. But then came the day that changed everything. Clara remembered it with painful clarity. The day her father came home, his face ashen and his hands shaking as he clutched a stack of papers. Edward Marshall's company, Marshall Corp., had acquired a chain of big box stores and was aggressively expanding into their neighborhood. The predatory pricing and marketing tactics employed by Marshall's company had decimated local businesses, including James's beloved hardware store. "It's over," James had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've lost everything." The following months were a blur of creditors, foreclosure notices, and hushed arguments behind closed doors. Clara watched helplessly as her once proud father took on multiple minimum wage jobs, working himself to exhaustion just to keep food on the table. Her mother, overwhelmed by stress and worry, fell ill, her vibrant spirit dimming with each passing day. As the train lurched to a stop, jolting Clara back to the present, she felt the familiar surge of anger and resentment rising within her. Edward Marshall had never known the faces of the people whose lives he had destroyed. To him, they were just collateral damage in his relentless pursuit of profit. Clara exited the subway and made her way through the bustling streets of Queens. The neighborhood had changed in the years since her family's downfall, gentrification slowly creeping in and pushing out longtime residents. Yet pockets of the old community remained, a testament to the resilience of those who refused to be uprooted. As she approached the rundown apartment building she now called home, Clara steeled herself for what awaited her inside. She climbed the creaky stairs to the third floor, each step a reminder of how far they had fallen. The sound of labored coughing greeted her as she opened the door. "Mom?" Clara called out, her voice laced with concern. She found Sarah Matthews in her usual spot by the window, a threadbare blanket wrapped around her frail shoulders. "Clara, sweetheart," Sarah smiled weakly, her once vibrant eyes now clouded with illness. "How did it go?" Clara knelt beside her mother, taking her hand. "I got the job, Mom. I start tomorrow." A flash of worry crossed Sarah's face. "Oh, honey, are you sure about this? Working for that man after everything he's done?" "It's the only way," Clara replied, her jaw set with determination. "We need the money and—" She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. "And you're still set on your plan?" It wasn't a question. Clara nodded, unable to meet her mother's gaze. The weight of her secret mission pressed down on her, a burden she couldn't fully share even with the person she loved most in the world. Just then the door opened again, and James Matthews trudged in, his body bent with exhaustion from another long day of thankless work. Clara's heart ached at the sight of her father, once a pillar of strength, now a shell of his former self. "Dad," she said, rising to greet him, "I have some news." As Clara explained her new position at Seacliff Manor, she watched a range of emotions flicker across her father's weathered face: surprise, concern, and something that looked almost like hope. "You'll be working for Edward Marshall?" James asked, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Clara nodded, bracing herself for his reaction. To her surprise, James pulled her into a fierce embrace. "You're so much stronger than I ever was," he whispered, his voice choked with unshed tears. As the small family huddled together in their tiny apartment, the contrast between their current circumstances and the opulence of Seacliff Manor couldn't have been starker. Clara felt the weight of their expectations, their unspoken hopes, settle on her shoulders. Later that night, as her parents slept, Clara sat at the kitchen table, poring over old newspaper clippings and financial reports. Each document was a piece of the puzzle, evidence of Edward Marshall's ruthless business practices and the lives he had ruined in his quest for wealth and power. She had spent years piecing together this information, driven by a need to understand the man who had destroyed her family's life. Now, as she prepared to enter the lion's den, Clara felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. As the first light of dawn crept through the grimy window, Clara made a solemn vow. She would not only expose Edward Marshall for the predator he was, but she would make him feel the pain and humiliation he had inflicted on so many others. Little did she know that her mission of vengeance was about to become far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. For behind the walls of Seacliff Manor, Edward Marshall harbored secrets of his own, secrets that would challenge everything Clara thought she knew about the man she had grown to hate. As she finally lay down to catch a few hours of sleep before her first day at Seacliff Manor, Clara couldn't shake the memory of that fleeting moment of recognition in Edward's eyes. What had he seen in her that had caused such a reaction? And more importantly, what would she discover about him in the days to come? The stage was set for a collision of past and present, of vengeance and redemption. And as Clara drifted off to sleep, the narrator's voice whispered once more, "The past is never truly forgotten. It lives on in our hearts, shaping our actions and driving us towards a future we cannot yet see." For Clara Matthews and Edward Marshall, that future was about to unfold in ways neither of them could have predicted. The early morning mist clung to the manicured lawns of Seacliff Manor as Clara made her way up the long driveway. The grand house loomed before her, its windows like watchful eyes, seeming to scrutinize her every move. Clara took a deep breath, steeling herself for the day ahead. She was no longer just Clara Matthews, daughter of a ruined small business owner. Today, she was Clara the Maid, here to serve the man who had destroyed her family's life. As she approached the service entrance, Mrs. Holloway appeared, her lips pursed in a permanent expression of disapproval. "You're 2 minutes late," she snapped, ushering Clara inside. "Mr. Marshall expects punctuality from all staff." Clara bit back a retort, reminding herself of her true purpose. She couldn't afford to antagonize anyone, not when she was so close to her goal. The next few hours were a whirlwind of instructions, cleaning supplies, and stern warnings about which areas of the house were strictly off-limits. Clara's mind raced, cataloging every detail, every potential opportunity for gathering information. It was nearly noon when Clara finally encountered Edward Marshall again. She was dusting the library shelves when he strode in, his attention fixed on the smartphone in his hand. For a moment, he didn't seem to notice her presence. Clara held her breath, watching him from the corner of her eye. In the soft light filtering through the library windows, Edward looked different from the cold, dismissive man she had met yesterday. There were lines of fatigue around his eyes, a slight slump to his shoulders that spoke of a weight beyond mere physical exhaustion. Suddenly, Edward looked up, startled to find someone else in the room. "Oh," he said, his usual mask of indifference slipping for just a moment. "I didn't realize." "Clara, isn't it?" Clara nodded, surprised that he had remembered her name. "Yes, Mr. Marshall, I'm sorry if I disturbed you. I can come back later." No, Edward waved her off, an unexpected note of, was that kindness in his voice. "Please continue your work, don't mind me." He settled into a leather armchair, setting aside his phone with a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Clara resumed her dusting, hyper-aware of his presence, waiting for the mask of the ruthless tycoon to slip back into place. But it didn't. Instead, Edward's gaze wandered to the rain-spattered windows, his expression distant and almost melancholic. "Do you like to read, Clara?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. The question caught her off guard. Yes, I do," she answered cautiously. Edward nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "This library was my father's pride and joy," he said, gesturing to the shelves around them. He believed that books were the great equalizer, that knowledge could lift a person out of any circumstance. Clara's hand froze mid-motion, her mind reeling. This wasn't the Edward Marshall she had expected. This contemplative, almost wistful man seemed a far cry from the heartless corporate raider she had imagined. "That's a beautiful thought," she said softly, meaning it despite herself. Edward's eyes met hers, and for a moment Clara saw a flash of vulnerability in their depths. "Yes," he murmured. "It is." Then, as if catching himself, he straightened in his chair, the familiar mask of cool professionalism sliding back into place. "Well, I'm sure you have other duties to attend to. Don't let me keep you." Clara nodded and hurried from the room, her heart pounding. What had just happened? She had come here expecting to find a monster, a soulless corporate machine. Instead, she had glimpsed something altogether more complex, a man with depths she hadn't anticipated. As the days passed, these moments of unexpected humanity became more frequent. Clara found herself constantly off balance, her carefully constructed image of Edward Marshall crumbling bit by bit. There was the morning she arrived to find him in the kitchen, attempting to make his own coffee after the regular cook had called in sick. His fumbling efforts with the complex espresso machine had been almost endearing. Then there was the afternoon she overheard him on the phone, his voice gentle and patient as he spoke to what seemed to be a child, a niece or nephew perhaps. The tenderness in his tone had been so at odds with the cutthroat businessman she had expected that Clara had to remind herself of her purpose, of the pain he had caused her family. But it was the incident with the stray cat that truly shook Clara's resolve. She had been tending to the flower beds near the edge of the property when she heard a pitiful mewing coming from a nearby bush. Investigating, she found a small, bedraggled kitten, its fur matted and its eyes wild with fear. As Clara coaxed the trembling creature out, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Edward watching, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Mr. Marshall," she said quickly. "I know I shouldn't be—" But Edward was already moving forward, crouching down beside her. "Is it hurt?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine concern. Before Clara could respond, Edward had gently scooped up the kitten, cradling it against his expensive suit without a second thought. "Poor little thing," he murmured, stroking its head. "Let's get you inside and cleaned up." Clara watched in stunned silence as Edward carried the kitten into the house, calling for Mrs. Holloway to bring some warm milk and a soft towel. The care and gentleness with which he tended to the small animal was so at odds with everything Clara thought she knew about him that she felt her world tilting on its axis. That night, as Clara lay in bed in her tiny apartment, her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The image of Edward Marshall, the man she had hated for so long, tenderly caring for a stray kitten, refused to leave her thoughts. She reached for the box under her bed, pulling out the carefully collected evidence of Edward's corporate misdeeds. The newspaper clippings and financial reports stared back at her, black and white proof of the devastation he had caused. And yet, Clara closed her eyes, remembering the vulnerability she had glimpsed in the library, the patience in his voice as he spoke to a child, the gentleness with which he had cared for the kitten. For the first time since she had embarked on her mission, Clara felt the stirring of doubt. Who was the real Edward Marshall? The ruthless tycoon who had destroyed her family's livelihood? Or the complex, sometimes kind man she was beginning to see glimpses of? As Clara drifted off to sleep, her resolve wavered. She had come to Seacliff Manor seeking vengeance, but now she found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. Could she go through with her plan to destroy Edward Marshall, knowing that there might be more to him than she had ever imagined? The narrator's voice whispered in the darkness. The heart is a treacherous thing, capable of seeing light in the darkest places. As Clara slept, the seeds of doubt took root, threatening to unravel everything she thought she knew. But the path of revenge is not easily abandoned, and the true test of her resolve was yet to come. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Clara made her way up the winding driveway of Seacliff Manor. 2 months had passed since she first stepped through those imposing gates, and with each day, the lines between her mission and her growing confusion blurred further. Today, however, something felt different. There was an unusual stillness about the grand house, a heaviness that seemed to press down on the manicured lawns and carefully tended gardens. As Clara entered through the service door, she was immediately struck by the tense atmosphere. Mrs. Holloway, usually a whirlwind of efficiency, stood in the kitchen, her face drawn with worry. "Oh, Clara," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "I'm glad you're here, Mr. Marshall. He's not himself today. Be careful around him." Clara's heart quickened. "What do you mean? Is something wrong?" Mrs. Holloway hesitated, then sighed. "It's the anniversary of his wife's death. He always takes it hard, but this year—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Wife?" Clara's mind reeled. In all her research, in all the articles and financial reports she'd pored over, she had never come across any mention of Edward Marshall being married. Before she could process this new information, a crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Mrs. Holloway flinched. "I'd better go see to that," she murmured, hurrying away. Left alone, Clara battled with her conflicting impulses. Part of her, the part still burning with the need for vengeance, whispered that this could be an opportunity. Edward was vulnerable, his defenses down. If ever there was a time to gather damaging information, it was now. But another voice, one that had grown stronger in recent weeks, held her back. The memory of Edward's gentleness with the stray kitten, the glimpses of humanity she'd witnessed. They tugged at her conscience. Torn, Clara began her usual cleaning routine, all the while hyper-aware of every sound from above. As she dusted the library shelves, the room where she'd first seen a crack in Edward's facade, her eyes fell on a small, leather-bound book partially hidden behind a row of first editions. Almost without thinking, Clara reached for it. The book fell open in her hands, revealing a photograph tucked between its pages. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The picture showed a younger Edward, his face alight with a joy she had never seen. Beside him stood a beautiful woman with warm eyes and a radiant smile. They were on a beach somewhere, windswept and laughing, looking for all the world like two people deeply in love. Her name was Sophia. Clara whirled around, her heart pounding. Edward stood in the doorway, his usual impeccable appearance in disarray. His tie was loosened, his hair mussed, and his eyes— Clara had never seen such raw pain in another person's gaze. "Mr. Marshall, I'm so sorry," she stammered, moving to replace the book. "I didn't mean to pry." But Edward waved her off, crossing the room with unsteady steps. He took the photograph from her hands, staring at it with an expression of such longing that Clara felt her own eyes prickling with unshed tears. "We were married for 5 years," Edward said softly, his voice rough with emotion. 5 years of absolute happiness. And then— He trailed off, his shoulders slumping. Clara stood frozen, unsure of what to do or say. This was so far beyond the scope of her planned revenge that she felt completely adrift. Edward sank into his leather armchair, still clutching the photograph. "She was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer," he continued, seeming to speak more to himself than to Clara. "We tried everything. Every treatment, every experimental drug. I was ready to spend every penny I had if it meant saving her." He looked up then, meeting Clara's eyes with a gaze so filled with anguish that she felt it like a physical blow. But in the end, none of it mattered. Money, power, influence— they meant nothing in the face of her illness. "She died in my arms and I—" His voice broke. "I've never been the same since." In that moment, Clara saw Edward Marshall stripped bare of all his defenses. Gone was the ruthless tycoon, the corporate raider who had destroyed her family's livelihood. In his place sat a broken man, still bleeding from a wound that had never truly healed. Without thinking, Clara moved to his side, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. Marshall," she said softly, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Edward's hand came up to cover hers, the touch sending an unexpected jolt through Clara's body. "Thank you, Clara," he murmured. "You know, you remind me of her sometimes. That same kindness in your eyes." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She should pull away, should remember her purpose for being here. But she couldn't bring herself to move. For a long moment, they stayed like that, connected by shared grief and an understanding that transcended words. Then, slowly, Edward straightened, some of his usual composure returning. "I apologize," he said, his voice steadier now. "I don't usually— This day is always difficult." Clara shook her head. "Please, don't apologize. We all need someone to lean on sometimes." Edward's eyes met hers, a flicker of warmth breaking through the pain. "Yes," he said softly. "I suppose we do." As Clara left the library, her mind was in turmoil. The man she had just comforted bore no resemblance to the heartless villain she had constructed in her mind. How could she reconcile the Edward Marshall who had devastated her family's life with this grieving widower, still raw with loss after all these years? That night, as Clara lay in bed, she found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She prayed. Not for guidance in her revenge, but for understanding. How could she continue with her plan, knowing what she now knew? And yet, how could she abandon the cause that had driven her for so long? As she drifted off into an uneasy sleep, the narrator's voice whispered, "The path of redemption is never straight, nor is it easily walked." For Edward Marshall, the journey had begun years ago, with the loss of his beloved wife. For Clara Matthews, it was just beginning, a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about justice, forgiveness, and the capacity of the human heart to change. The stage was set for a profound transformation, one that would shake the foundations of Seacliff Manor and forever alter the lives of those within its walls. But as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, neither Clara nor Edward could have imagined the trials and revelations that lay ahead. The autumn chill had given way to winter's icy grip as Clara hurried up the driveway of Seacliff Manor, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. 3 months had passed since that fateful day in the library, and with each passing week, Clara found herself more conflicted about her purpose here. Today, however, she pushed those thoughts aside. She had a job to do. Edward had asked her to help prepare the house for a small gathering of business associates. It was the first time he'd hosted such an event since she'd started working at the manor, and Clara couldn't help but feel a flutter of nervous anticipation. As she entered the house, the usual calm efficiency of the staff had been replaced by a flurry of activity. Mrs. Holloway was directing a team of caterers, her voice sharp with stress. Clara quickly got to work, determined to ensure everything was perfect. Hours passed in a blur of polishing silver, arranging flowers and making sure every surface gleamed. As the first guests began to arrive, Clara retreated to the kitchen, her role now to assist with serving drinks and hors d'oeuvres. From her vantage point, Clara observed Edward as he greeted his guests. He was the picture of the suave, successful businessman, charming, confident, and utterly in control. Yet Clara couldn't help but notice the subtle signs of strain around his eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach them. As the evening wore on, Clara found herself increasingly uneasy. Snatches of conversation drifted her way, talk of mergers and acquisitions, of companies being bought out and restructured. It was a stark reminder of why she had come here in the first place, of the ruthless business practices that had destroyed her family's livelihood. But then she'd catch Edward's eye across the room, see that flicker of warmth that seemed reserved just for her, and her resolve would waver once more. It was nearing midnight when the last guest departed. Edward loosened his tie with a sigh of relief, the mask of the perfect host slipping away. "Clara," he called softly, "would you mind bringing a bottle of scotch to my study? I could use a nightcap." Clara nodded, her heart racing. This was the first time Edward had asked her to his private study, the one room in the house that had always been off limits. As she approached the heavy oak door, balancing a silver tray with the scotch in a tumbler, Clara heard Edward's voice. He seemed to be on the phone, his tone hushed but urgent. "I don't care what it takes," he was saying. "Buy them out, crush them if you have to. I want that property and I want it now." Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. The words were so at odds with the Edward she thought she had come to know that for a moment, she couldn't process what she was hearing. With trembling hands, she pushed open the door. Edward looked up, his face flushed with what Clara now recognized as triumph. "Ah, Clara," he said, his voice warm. "Thank you. Just set it down there." As Clara placed the tray on his desk, her eyes fell on a stack of documents. The letterhead made her heart stop. Matthew's Hardware, her family's old store. In that moment, everything shifted. Clara's vision tunneled, focusing on those papers with laser-like intensity. Without thinking, she reached out and snatched them up. "Clara," Edward's voice was sharp with surprise and anger. "What do you think you're doing?" But Clara was beyond hearing. Her eyes raced over the documents, taking in every damning detail. It was all there. The predatory pricing strategies, the backroom deals with suppliers, the deliberate targeting of small businesses in specific neighborhoods. And at the center of it all, Edward Marshall's signature. "You," Clara whispered, her voice shaking with rage and betrayal. "It was you all along." Edward stood, his face a mask of confusion. "Clara, what are you talking about? Put those papers down immediately." But Clara was beyond following orders. Months of conflicted emotions, of doubt and growing affection, all burned away in the face of this irrefutable evidence. "Matthew's Hardware," she spat. "My family's store. You destroyed it. You destroyed us." Understanding dawned on Edward's face, followed quickly by shock. "Matthews, your last name, I never made the connection." "No, you wouldn't have, would you?" Clara's voice was bitter. "We were just collateral damage in your grand schemes. Nameless, faceless victims of your greed." Edward took a step towards her, his hands outstretched in a placating gesture. "Clara, please, let me explain. It wasn't personal. It was just business." "Just business?" Clara's laugh was harsh, bordering on hysterical. "My father worked himself to the bone trying to save that store. My mother's health failed because of the stress. And you're telling me it was just business?" The weight of everything, her mission, her growing feelings for Edward, the truth of what he had done, came crashing down on Clara. She sank to her knees, the documents scattering around her like fallen leaves. Edward stood frozen, the color draining from his face as the full impact of Clara's words hit him. For the first time, he was face to face with the human cost of his actions, embodied in the young woman he had come to care for deeply. "Clara," he whispered, his voice breaking, I never knew. I never thought about the people behind the numbers. But Clara was beyond hearing his explanations or apologies. Tears streaming down her face, she looked up at Edward, seeing him clearly for the first time since she had entered Seacliff Manor. I came here to destroy you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, to make you feel the pain you caused us. But I never thought I could. Edward fell to his knees beside her, reaching out to touch her shoulder. Clara flinched away, the conflict in her heart almost too much to bear. Please, Edward begged, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Give me a chance to make this right, to atone for what I've done. As Clara looked into Edward's eyes, she saw genuine remorse, a man grappling with the consequences of his actions for perhaps the first time in his life. But she also saw the Edward she had come to know over the past months, the grieving widower, the man who cared for stray kittens, the broken soul seeking redemption. In that moment, kneeling on the floor of Edward Marshall's study, surrounded by the evidence of his past misdeeds, Clara Matthews faced the most difficult decision of her life. Could she find it in her heart to forgive the man who had caused her family so much pain? Or was the chasm between them too wide to ever truly bridge? The narrator's voice whispered, heavy with the weight of the moment. In the crucible of truth, the hardest metal of the human spirit is forged. For Clara and Edward, this night would mark either the end of their journey together or the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. The choice lay in Clara's hands, and with it, the power to shape not just her own future, but Edward's as well. As the clock struck midnight, the fate of two souls hung in the balance, poised on the knife edge between vengeance and redemption. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, its somber tones echoing through the suddenly silent study. Clara and Edward remained frozen, the weight of revelation and years of pain hanging heavy between them. Clara's mind raced, a kaleidoscope of conflicting emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The rage she had nursed for so long warred with the affection that had grown, unbidden, over the past months. She looked at Edward, really looked at him, and saw a man torn apart by the realization of his own actions. Edward's face was a mask of anguish, his usual composure shattered. Clara, he began, his voice hoarse, I know that nothing I say can undo what I've done. But please, let me try to make amends. Tell me how I can make this right. Clara let out a bitter laugh. Make it right? How can you possibly make this right? Can you give my father back his dignity? Can you restore my mother's health? Can you erase years of struggle and pain? She stood abruptly, needing to put distance between herself and Edward. As she paced the study, her eyes fell on the photos lining the walls, evidence of Edward's success, his triumphs. Each image now seemed like a mockery of the lives he had destroyed in his climb to the top. You know, Clara said, her voice eerily calm. When I came here, I had it all planned out. I was going to gather evidence, expose your ruthless practices to the world. I wanted to see you ruined, to feel the same helplessness my family felt. Edward flinched at her words but didn't interrupt. He stood slowly, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his guilt. But then, Clara continued, I saw another side of you. The man who mourned his wife, who showed kindness to a stray kitten. I started to doubt myself, to wonder if I had misjudged you. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. And now I find out that it was all true. Every terrible thing I believed about you, it was all real. Edward took a tentative step towards her. Clara, please. The man you've come to know these past months, that's the real me too. I've changed. Losing Sophia, it made me reevaluate everything. I've been trying to be better, to make amends for my past actions. And yet, Clara shot back, you were on the phone just now talking about crushing another company. Old habits die hard, don't they, Mr. Marshall? Edward's face fell. You're right, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been trying to change, but it's not easy. The business world is all I've known for so long. But meeting you, getting to know you, it's made me want to be better, to be the man you thought I was. Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes. How can I believe you? How can I trust anything you say? In that moment, something seemed to shift in Edward. He straightened, a look of determination replacing the guilt on his face. You're right. Words aren't enough. I need to show you that I mean what I say." He strode to his desk and picked up the phone. "Get me the board," he barked into the receiver. "Emergency meeting first thing tomorrow morning." Clara watched in stunned silence as Edward began firing off orders. "Cancel all acquisitions in progress. I want a full review of our business practices, focusing on their impact on local communities. And get me a list of every small business we've put out of competition in the last decade. We're going to make this right." As he spoke, Clara saw a fire in Edward's eyes that she had never witnessed before. This wasn't the calculated ruthlessness of a corporate raider, but the passion of a man on a mission of redemption. When he finally hung up the phone, Edward turned back to Clara. "I know this doesn't erase what I've done," he said softly. "But it's a start. I'm going to use every resource at my disposal to help the people I've hurt, starting with your family, Clara. Whatever it takes, I'll make sure they're taken care of." Clara felt her knees weaken, overwhelmed by the suddenness of it all. She sank into a nearby chair, her mind reeling. "Why?" she whispered. "Why now?" Edward knelt before her, taking her hands in his. The touch sent a jolt through Clara, a reminder of the connection that had grown between them. "Because of you," he said simply. "You've shown me what really matters. You've made me want to be the man I should have been all along." As Clara looked into Edward's eyes, she saw genuine remorse, determination, and something else, a warmth that made her heart race. She wanted to believe him, wanted it more than she had ever wanted anything in her life. But the pain of the past still echoed in her heart. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said honestly. "Not yet. There's too much hurt, too much history." Edward nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness, Clara. But I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can change, that I can make things right." Clara took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a precipice. Everything she had believed, everything she had planned, had been turned upside down. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Show me. Show me that you mean what you say." The relief on Edward's face was palpable. He squeezed her hands gently. "I will," he promised. "Every day, in every way I can. I'll prove to you that the man you've come to know these past months is real." As they sat there in the quiet of the study, the first light of dawn began to seep through the windows. It felt symbolic somehow, the darkness of the past giving way to the possibility of a new day. The narrator's voice whispered, tinged with both caution and hope. "The road to redemption is long and fraught with challenges. For Edward Marshall, the journey was just beginning, a journey that would test his resolve, his principles, and the depth of his newfound commitment to change. For Clara Matthews, the path ahead was equally uncertain, a delicate balance between guarding her heart and allowing herself to believe in the possibility of transformation. As the new day dawned, both of them, the study of Seacliff Manor, once a symbol of corporate power and ruthless ambition, had become the crucible in which two souls began the arduous process of forging a new beginning. The story of Clara Matthews and Edward Marshall was far from over. In many ways, it was only just beginning. The weeks following that fateful night in Edward's study were a whirlwind of activity at Seacliff Manor. True to his word, Edward had set in motion a series of sweeping changes that sent shockwaves through the business world. Clara watched with a mixture of amazement and lingering skepticism as the man she had once viewed as her enemy worked tirelessly to make amends for his past actions. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Edward approached Clara as she tended to the manor's winter garden. "I need your help with something," he said, his voice tinged with nervous energy. "There's an event I want you to attend with me." Clara raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "What kind of event?" Edward took a deep breath. "I'm holding a press conference. I'm going to publicly announce the changes we're making and take responsibility for my past actions." Clara's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you sure about this? The press will tear you apart." A wry smile played at Edward's lips. "Probably. But it's the right thing to do. And I want you there, Clara. You're the reason for all of this. Your strength, your integrity. It's what's pushing me to be better. Heart racing, Clara nodded. Okay, I'll be there. The following day, Clara found herself standing at the back of a packed conference room in downtown Manhattan. Reporters from every major news outlet jostled for position, an expectant buzz filling the air. As Edward took the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, Edward began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. I've called you here today to make an announcement that is long overdue. Clara held her breath as Edward launched into his speech. With unflinching honesty, he detailed the predatory business practices that had built his empire, acknowledging the lives and livelihoods that had been destroyed in the process. He announced a comprehensive plan to make reparations to affected communities and small businesses, starting with a substantial fund dedicated to revitalizing areas hit hardest by his company's expansion. As Edward spoke, Clara couldn't help but marvel at the transformation before her. This was not the cold, calculating businessman she had first encountered, nor was it the broken man mourning his lost love. This was someone new, a leader taking responsibility for his actions and committing to genuine change. The room erupted into chaos as Edward finished speaking. Reporters shouted questions, demanding more details, more explanations. Through it all, Edward remained calm, answering each query with a transparency that was both shocking and refreshing in the cutthroat world of big business. Suddenly, a voice cut through the clamor. Mr. Marshall, is it true that your change of heart was inspired by a personal connection to one of the victims of your business practices? Clara froze, her heart pounding. She saw Edward's eyes scan the room, finally landing on her. In that moment, she saw a decision being made in real time. Yes, Edward said quietly, his gaze never leaving Clara's. I recently learned that someone very important to me had been directly affected by my past actions. It opened my eyes to the real human cost of what I had done. The room fell silent for a beat, then exploded into a new frenzy of questions. Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning to her, the spotlight suddenly and uncomfortably on her presence at the back of the room. Edward raised his hands, calling for quiet. That's all for now, thank you for your time. As security began to usher the press out, Edward made his way through the crowd to Clara's side. I'm sorry, he said softly. I didn't mean to put you in the spotlight like that, I couldn't lie. Not anymore. Clara nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. It's okay, I understand. As they exited the building, they were met by a wall of cameras and shouted questions. Edward instinctively moved to shield Clara, but she straightened her shoulders and faced the crowd head-on. Miss, are you the person Mr. Marshall mentioned? How do you feel about his announcement? Clara took a deep breath, feeling Edward's supportive presence beside her. My name is Clara Matthews, she said, her voice clear and strong. My family's business was one of many destroyed by Mr. Marshall's practices, but I've also witnessed firsthand his commitment to change. It won't erase the past, but it's a start. As they made their way through the crowd to the waiting car, Clara felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For so long, she had carried the burden of her family's pain in silence. Now, it was out in the open, acknowledged and validated. Once safely inside the car, Edward turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and regret. Clara, I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am for everything you and your family have been through. What you did back there, your grace, your strength, it's more than I deserve. Clara met his gaze, seeing the man she had come to know over these past months. Flawed, yes, but genuinely striving to be better. It's not about what you deserve, Edward. It's about what you do from here on out. As the car wound its way back to Seacliff Manor, a comfortable silence fell between them. Clara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come seeking vengeance, but had found something far more complex. The possibility of redemption not just for Edward but for herself as well. The narrator's voice whispered, heavy with the weight of the day's events. In the crucible of public scrutiny, Edward Marshall had taken the first step on a long and difficult path. His willingness to sacrifice his carefully cultivated image, to lay bare his sins before the world, was a testament to the profound change Clara had inspired in him. But for Clara Matthews, the true test was yet to come. Could she find it in her heart to fully forgive the man who had caused her family so much pain? As Seacliff Manor came into view, its imposing silhouette a reminder of all that had transpired, both Clara and Edward knew that their story was far from over. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles both public and personal. But for the first time they faced that future not as adversaries, but as allies united in a common cause: the pursuit of redemption and the hope of healing old wounds. The aftermath of Edward's press conference sent shockwaves through the business world and beyond. For weeks, Seacliff Manor was besieged by reporters, all clamoring for more details about the dramatic transformation of one of America's most ruthless tycoons. Through it all, Clara remained a steady presence, watching as Edward tirelessly worked to make good on his promises. It was a crisp spring morning, nearly 6 months after that fateful night in Edward's study, when Clara found herself walking along the beach near Seacliff Manor. The sound of waves lapping at the shore soothed her tumultuous thoughts. So much had changed, and yet she still felt the weight of the past tugging at her heart. Lost in thought, she almost didn't notice Edward approaching until he was right beside her. "Beautiful morning," he said softly, his eyes on the horizon. Clara nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "It is." They walked in companionable silence for a while, the rising sun casting a golden glow over the water. Finally, Edward spoke again, his voice tinged with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "I wanted to show you something," he said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "It's done. The Matthews hardware restoration project is complete." Clara's breath caught in her throat as she took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were photos of a beautifully renovated storefront, the familiar sign of her family's business shining like new. But it was more than just a restoration. The photos showed a thriving business, expanded and modernized, yet still retaining the charm that had made it the heart of their community for so many years. "Edward, this is..." Clara trailed off, overwhelmed by emotion. "It's not just your family store," Edward explained gently. "We've set up a fund to help revitalize the entire neighborhood. Small business loans, community development projects, job training programs. Your father is overseeing a lot of it. He's quite a remarkable man, Clara. I can see where you get your strength from." Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes. The magnitude of what Edward had done, not just for her family, but for an entire community, was almost too much to comprehend. She thought of her father, broken and defeated for so long, now given a chance to rebuild and help others do the same. "Why?" she whispered, finally looking up to meet Edward's gaze. "Why go to such lengths?" Edward's eyes softened as he looked at her. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because I've caused so much pain and it's time to heal those wounds. And..." He hesitated, then continued. "Because you showed me what true integrity looks like, Clara. You made me want to be a better man." In that moment, standing on the beach with the morning sun warming their faces, Clara felt the last walls around her heart begin to crumble. She saw before her not the Edward Marshall who had destroyed her family's livelihood, but a man who had faced his mistakes head-on and worked tirelessly to make amends. "I forgive you," Clara said softly, the words falling from her lips before she even realized she was speaking them. "I forgive you, Edward." The impact of those simple words was profound. Edward's eyes filled with tears and he reached out to take Clara's hand. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." As they stood there hand in hand, Clara felt a sense of peace washing over her. The anger and resentment that had driven her for so long began to ebb away, replaced by something new: hope, understanding, and perhaps even the stirrings of love. "You know," Clara said after a moment, a hint of a smile in her voice, "when I came here all those months ago, I never could have imagined this. I wanted to destroy you, to make you feel the pain my family felt. But now..." "Now?" Edward prompted gently. Clara turned to face him fully, her eyes shining with a mixture of tears and newfound clarity. "Now I see that revenge would have only perpetuated the cycle of pain. True strength isn't about tearing others down. It's about having the courage to rebuild, to make things right even when it seems impossible. Edward nodded, understanding etched on his face. You've taught me that, Clara. Your strength, your compassion, it's changed everything. Not just for me, but for so many others. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Clara and Edward began to walk back towards Seacliff Manor. With each step, Clara felt the burden of the past lifting, replaced by a sense of purpose and possibility. "So what happens now?" she asked, glancing at Edward. He smiled, a genuine warmth lighting up his face. "Now we keep working. There's still so much to do, so many lives to touch. And I was hoping you might consider staying on. Not as a maid, of course, but as a partner in all of this. Your insight, your experience, they're invaluable, Clara." Clara felt her heart skip a beat at the word partner. She knew he meant it in a business sense, but there was an undercurrent of something more, a potential for a deeper connection that both thrilled and frightened her. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." As they approached Seacliff Manor, its imposing facade now seeming more like a beacon of hope than a symbol of corporate greed, the narrator's voice whispered one last time. In the end, it wasn't revenge that healed Clara's wounds or redeemed Edward's soul. It was forgiveness, freely given and hard-earned. Their journey had been one of pain, growth, and ultimately, transformation. Clara Matthews and Edward Marshall stood at the threshold of a new chapter, not just in their own lives, but in the lives of countless others they now had the power to help. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But together, they had found something far more powerful than vengeance or wealth. They had discovered the transformative power of compassion, the strength that comes from admitting one's mistakes, and the healing that can occur when we choose to build rather than destroy. As they entered Seacliff Manor, no longer as employer and employee but as equals united in a common cause, both Clara and Edward knew that their greatest work was just beginning. And in that work, in the lives they would touch and the communities they would help rebuild, they would find a purpose and a connection deeper than either of them could have ever imagined.
So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.